Hi there, this is Carl Irwin, and this is a walkthrough of the mock-up for a Topsail Vista. So very quickly, we're in Musescore 4, and everything that we discuss here will apply to the Muse Sounds and creating mock-ups inside of Musescore 4. Very quickly on the piece, Topsail Island is a barrier island in North Carolina on the southern side of North Carolina, and it is a vacation spot that I've been going to for over 40 years. And then the family going back generationally has been going a lot longer than that. So it's a place I really love, place I visit every year. And I've been wanting to write a piece just kind of based on inspiration from that location for a couple of years. I finally took some time, some late nights over the last week and a half to compose a piece. So, this is what's come of it. That's the background. And just quickly on the location, too, if you're not familiar with the area, so you can kind of have a visual here as I discuss the music. The eastern coast of the United States is covered, or rather trailed, all the way up with a set of barrier islands and an intercoastal waterway. You could essentially take a boat almost the entire length of the East Coast from Florida all the way up to Maine without having to go into open water very much because of these barrier islands that are there, particularly in the central part of the country through the Carolinas, Georgia, through the Carolinas, through Virginia. You'll have these barrier islands there, and they're white sand barrier islands. They're beautiful, great, locations. If you've ever watched a Philip Spark movie or read the books, Philip Spark's books, his romance, books, those movies, they're shot in this area, and that is a kind of a good idea of what the location looks like. So that's the picture. It's a very, very picturesque view of the ocean, white sand beach. Sand dunes, vacation houses. That's the kind of picture. So, inspiration for this, I've long been a fan of pieces that are written, that composers compose based on locations that they've been to. Famous wind ensemble piece, Rocky Point Holiday, is a great wind ensemble piece, very energetic piece composed, for a location. I've also loved the sound of kind of the epic side of John Williams. I mean, who hasn't been influenced by John Williams in this generation? And I had a particular texture in my mind with respect to added note harmonies that I really kind of sit heavily on. I also was thinking about some particular music from Williams, specifically his score for Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And I know there's a lot of very alien sort of sounds in that, and particularly harmonically. But I've always liked the sense of wonder in it. So there's a little bit of that in there. There's even a moment later on where I'll get to the pitch collection in a moment, where I lay out a pitch collection in the similar texture to what that music does in its kind of apex finale moment. It's not the same music. It's not even really orchestrated in the same way, but it's that concept I really liked, and I wanted to kind of infuse into this. So I guess between Ron Nelson and his Rocky Point Holiday and his kind of musical expression there of a location, and then of course some of these Williams ideas related to added note harmonies. And I'll talk about harmony in a minute and just how I feel about harmony and my kind of concept of harmony. And then a little bit of that Close Encounters of the Third Kind of vibe going on. So that's it. Now this is a cipher piece. This is cipher music. And it's actually constructed on a pitch collection that is a musical cipher. This is something that I do with some frequency. I don't write all of my music like this, but I do it often. I even do it in the film score stuff that I do, the short films that I write music for. I will often grab some kind of a musical cipher to create a melody or to render out a melody that has sort of a meta relationship to the content. So we'll get to that in a moment. Let's talk about Musescore for a second and the sounds and just a little bit of philosophy on mocking up in Musescore. Let me show you the mixer. So instrumentation-wise, I've got piccolo, flute, oboe, clarinet, bassoon. That's the woodwind complement. And I have just a solo instrument for each of these. Now, there are times when there may be more than one note being played, not so much for the woodwinds, but for the brass later on. I've found that in terms of the trickery involved in mock-ups, for Muse Sounds, I've found it best to avoid or stay away from the ensemble patches, except for the strings. I'll say the strings are a separate issue. But for the woodwinds and brass, I find that it's quite deceptive to just use the solo sounds, the solo set, and then if you have to have a division, you just divide it on the single staff. It saves on space. You can still kind of pan sections to where they need to be. But the reason for this is that it is deceptive enough to have the solo sound. With a really, really great orchestra, if you have, say, two trumpets playing a unison part, a melodic unison part, because it's a professional group, it can be difficult to determine how many instruments are playing. Especially if there's other things going on. If there's a moment where you have a couple of instruments playing, like instruments playing unison, and there's other stuff going on around it, it can be very difficult to determine exactly how many players there are. So based on that deception, I think it's just easier and cleaner to go with single solo instruments and then divide. And this also avoids another problem that can happen in mock-ups. If you're using an ensemble patch and then you divide that ensemble into a division, you then have an exponential increase in players. So I prefer to put the deceptive side of the mock-up on the expression of a single player as a section rather than as a section patch as a group that is half the size of what that patch really represents, if that makes sense. So I use single instruments in a lot of my mock-ups, not only for the woodwinds, but also for the brass. So I have a single horn, single trumpet, single trombone, a bass trombone, and then a tuba. And that is my complement. How many players would there really be in the score? It's hard to say. I'm not sure I ever really double the woodwinds, so I guess there'd be single players there. For the brass section, I think I have a division up to 3 for the horn at one point, a division up to 2 for the trumpet, a division up to 2 for the trombone, a single bass trombone, single tuba. So you're looking at a pretty typical kind of symphonic complement, maybe a little short on horns because the division, again, is only up to about 3. But that is how I treat the mock-up, and you'll see it works pretty well. It is quite deceptive. It does sound, even when there's solo instruments playing with other things going on, it does give a section sort of quality without kind of overblowing the number of samples that are being performed, which is something you want to avoid. For the percussion complement, I just grab what I need. There's not really a lot of remarkable stuff going on here. Some usual things. I've got a snare drum that I only use for the rims. Playing. I don't actually have any snare drum playing in this piece. Timpani, bass drum. There's a triangle mark tree for some, auxiliary stuff. I do have a crash cymbal and a suspended cymbal. I don't know how you can do contemporary music without suspended cymbal, but it's not included in the symphonic templates in Musescore for some reason. It only has the crash. I have a tam-tam in there for that gong kind of moment. I use in a couple of places. Celestin piano. So I have, since my early days composing when I was in college, over 20 years ago, I've gotten away from using harp unless I really, really want it, even for mock-ups. And I guess this comes out of having the opportunity to write for a symphonic orchestra during college when you didn't always reliably have a harpist. Harpists are hard to come by. So this is just something I've kind of morphed into where I've replaced the harp with a Celeste and piano. And I tend to write that way. So I just, in place of the things that a harp would do, I've been using Celeste and grand piano a lot in my writing, even more so recently. And I don't necessarily use them as keyboard instruments. They're used mostly just for solo melodic moments or for embellishment, as you would use a harp. I mean, that's what you would use a harp for. So that's the keyboard complement. Now the strings, you'll notice here I have full section strings. I've got violin 1, violin 2, viola, cello, and then contrabass. Now what I did is I extended this though. It's going back on that issue with division. When you divide a section with a section patch, you exponentially increase the number of players. So what I do is I double the all the strings with a solo instance, and then I pan it slightly closer to the center. So I've got my violin 1 to the left 70%, negative 70. Violin 2 is 70 the other direction, but then I have a solo instance of these that are 40 either way. And that gives kind of a closer central instance of a single player playing that same part. And then I have the volume mixed down quite a bit. And then the viola section I have at 40% left, cello 40% right, and then the solo instances are 20 respectively in their location. Contrabass I set to the middle. Now this is not realistic to a live space. Most live spaces, you wouldn't necessarily do this. Often you'd put contrabasses on the right. You might even have the violins first and second on the left, and then viola on the right, cello to the far right, and then basses kind of behind the viola and cello. But for the a sound palette, for the stereo image, this is how I like to do it, particularly for the film stuff that I do. And then because this is a mock-up being created for listening, and not for a live environment, I do a little bit of unrealistic configuration, and I put the basses in the center. The brass and woodwinds are panned within 40 either way. And again, I like to put the bass instruments more central. And I put my keyboard instruments central. My major percussion parts I put very central. I like to put timpani to the right, bass to the right, kind of the mainline instruments more central. Keyboards, if I'm using keyboards, I'll put them to the left. I'm not using any here. So I just kind of split my cymbals up so I have some on the left, some on the right. You have a little bit more balanced stereo image, and I don't pan them too far. And then for the strings, I add one more instance of the basses, and it is a warm synthesizer pad. And it's just the classic Musescore sound synthesizer pad. I put a little bit of reverb on it, and I have it set really low. And if you look at the music, this will be an octave below the bass. So it's a sub bass. It's an extra sound that is an octave lower than the actual bass to give it some real meat and potatoes whenever it's playing sustained sound. I'll only use this whenever it's playing sustained sound, and again, it's mixed really low. What I do is I mix it down to the point where you can't hear it, and then I push it up just until you can hear it, and then I pull it back a little bit from there. So I take it all the way to the bottom, I bring it up until it's just noticeable, and then I pull it back just a little bit. And that way, it's not like another instrument in the ensemble. It's just adding a sonic quality that is very contemporary to sound mixing today. So that is the instrumentation setup. That's what I've come to do in Musescore with Muse Sounds. So now let's look at the score. What I did is I set this to breakaway, cutaway, so that whenever you are looking at the score, you're not confused by a bunch of empty measures. You only see what is being played for our purposes. Also, I have this set to concert pitch just so that it can make the discussions about theory a little bit more simple. I compose in concert pitch. It's just a lot easier that way in terms of grabbing things and transposing and dropping things into place. So anyway, that's the setup. Let's get into the music. So this has a cipher. It has a musical cipher, and you hear it right away. Now, if you want to hear the piece in its entirety, I'll have a link to the video of the piece on the channel in the description. You can go hear the piece in its entirety. I'm not going to do that here right now. We'll listen to it piece by piece and jump around a little bit. So here's the opening. Okay, so right here we have F, A, C in the violin, solo violin. Another reason to have a solo violin patch is that it allows me to do this too. So I can have soloistic playing. And another thing that I'll bring up later when it comes to doubling instruments, I'll try to remember to discuss this, that there's a major advantage to using a solo patch against the section strings. But here I have a solo violin playing F, A, C, and then violin 2 comes in with E, A, B down in the basement. And then the viola plays a single E down here. Okay, so we have F, A, C, E, A, B, E. This spells out Topsail, Topsail. So the name is actually a musical cipher, and there's different ways to do this. I have used a lot of different methods. You can do a chromatic one, where a letter of the alphabet represents a chromatic note. There will be some repetition. It can cycle back around. This is a diatonic representation of it. So you just take the letters A through G, and then as the alphabet continues, it just cycles back around. And you can add accidentals as you see fit to give some variety. Here it's just diatonic. It's just a diatonic representation of Topsail using that diatonic cipher, A through G, repeating. So it's in essentially the key of C. I don't use key signatures in my scoring anymore, unless I'm writing for a scholastic group, like a wind ensemble or a concert band. It's a little easier to use key signatures for younger players. But usually when I'm writing symphonic music, I just ignore key signatures and I put an atonal key signature at the beginning. So you won't see any key signatures show up. Everything will be represented in accidentals. So diatonically representing Topsail. This gets repeated again in the woodwinds. Okay, so we get it one more time. The woodwinds give it to us, and the strings give us the same pitch collection again. But here, the resolution, rather than going to the tonic on C with E in the third, it actually modulates. It modulates to the key of E. Let me talk a little bit about harmony. I mentioned at the beginning that I really like added note harmonies, and this is just something I've picked up on that I do regularly. It's how I write. I tend to add notes that don't belong. It's a very John Williams thing to do. Sometimes it's represented in polytonality, where you have multiple unrelated chords playing on top of each other. However, I look at it in a much more reductive manner. I like to add a note, a diatonic note, that simply doesn't belong to the chord, the triad that's in there, or an extended harmony. There might be an extension of the harmony, but I like to add another note that simply does not belong, usually a diatonic note. What notes do I like to add? I like to add the second, 4, and 6. Those are kind of the big ones. And there's a long history of that kind of harmony extension. Now, the jazz players would look at this and maybe refer to it as a ninth, but I like to add it in cluster, so it's actually sitting in the second position if I'm using a second, or in the fourth position, or in the sixth. I tend to go for the added note that has that avoids a minor second relationship to another note in the chord. So diatonically speaking, you can have the second playing almost in every chord, and it creates some added variety. It creates the feeling, like I said, as the jazz musicians would say, the sensation of an inverted extended harmony. You got to be careful with this, though, because it can make some parts very uninteresting, particularly someone who's hanging around that second. Their part might not move very much, and they'll be stuck there. Another thing that that avoids that kind of problem that I subscribe to is striking features and melodies. I believe strongly that melodies should have large leaps and big jumps. I think that striking features like that make a melody more memorable and much easier to kind of ingrain into the mind and the ear of the listener. So I go for larger leaps, larger gaps, and more motion, more moving around. I really hate repeating notes. If I have a repeating note in a part, I'm inclined to tie it so that it's not repeating. It's rather sustaining while other things are moving on around it. Repeated notes is such a pop music kind of trope. I avoid it like the plague. I like to have larger leaps and jumps. If I'm looking at, if I were to critique like Disney music, Alan Menken much preferred large leaps and jumps and striking features in the melodies. And because of that, his melodies and the Sherman Brothers too. I mean, a lot of those classic Disney composers, his music is much more memorable than a lot of the contemporary music that's coming out with, Walt Disney Animation and Pixar. So, large leaps. So that's kind of my theory of music, harmony and melody in a nutshell. So you'll hear those kinds of ideas being repeated over and over and over again. So you see these clusters pop up in here. I don't have a particular favoring of open spaces versus closed spacing. I kind of just, whatever makes sense. I try to maintain some contrary motion as best I can between the bass and whatever's happening on the top, just to have a counterpoint going on. But I don't have any hard rules about that sort of thing. If I want to project more Americana, I will open up the spacing and try to get wider intervals to give that sort of sensation and feeling. So anyway, that's the harmony. So let's go on here. We're now in the key of E, and then in the key of E, I deliver a little melody, a little kind of motivic figure that repeats over a very simple diatonic sort of chord progression. So we get it twice. First time is in the woodwinds. There's some staggered entrances here to make the parts, if people were going to play this, you'd want it to be playable. No one will. It's being mocked up. So you'll notice that there's an overuse of articulation and dynamics. So let's talk about Musescore here for a moment. We have this melody. You see a bunch of different dynamics down here on the Celeste on the piano. One flaw with the Celeste and the piano is that its humanization and playback is very stagnant. If you put a dynamic on it, it will play that dynamic on every single hit, and that's not very realistic to players. So whenever I have an exposed part on a keyboard part, and only in the exposed parts, you see later on when it's not exposed anymore, I ignore it. I will put a bunch of neighboring dynamics in at random locations just to give it more human playback. In fact, you can kind of hear this if I select it. We'll come out of the publish mode here, and I'll select just the piano and the Celeste and play that back. You can hear it's a lot more realistic. Some things kind of drop down or stand out, and it feels like there's a human touching the key. So that's one trick that I'll share with you. The other thing, if you look at the brass section up here, when this gets repeated in a chromatic kind of setting with the strings, we had a bunch of chromaticism in there on the repetition. The brass section is playing some background hits and swells. The one issue with Muse Sounds that I know a lot of people gripe about, particularly with the trumpets, but all the brass, I think, in general, the percussion, I think, suffers from this too, is that it kind of goes from, if dynamics are on a scale of 1 to 10, it kind of goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 11. There's this big jump at forte fortissimo between mezzo forte and forte in the brass and the percussion samples that get really aggressive. I kind of wish there was a sample in there, just one velocity layer between. I'm a brass player, so I know what I'm talking about when I make this gripe. I'm not like a woodwind player or a string player that's never played a brass instrument and complaining about what brass, should sound like. I'm a brass player, and I contend there is kind of a missing layer in these samples. It's not a big issue, though. It's not a really crucial issue. It's just what it does is it's not really an issue of volume. It's an issue of tone quality. It goes very brassy very quickly. When you go from mezzo forte, where it's not brassy, and then you go to forte, which suddenly it's brassy, even though it's dynamically not really louder or extremely louder than the mezzo forte. I think there is a gap there, but it's not too extreme. It's just the tone quality. See, there is a quality between that's missing. So how can you deal with this? Now, I didn't do it on this piece, but you can just add an additional instrument layer and use mezzo forte with accents or just mezzo forte, and then bring it up in the mix to cover kind of those gaps. If you really, really need to cover it, that's one way to deal with it. I have found that the brassy, edgy side of these samples are so good and so harsh that they actually work pretty well for muted tones. So there's no mute samples yet in Musescore 4. Hopefully very soon they'll add that in. I know they're adding stuff all the time. So if you don't have like an SF2 sample to bring in, or some other VST, depending on your platform, or I have an SF2 sample for muted trumpets that I use, I'll bring in. Not the Musescore one, but another one that's of a much higher fidelity. But if you don't have that, what you can do is you can use fortissimo brass at a very low mix level. Emulates, especially if there's other things going on, it emulates muted brass quite well. It gives you that very buzzy quality. Just bring down the volume in the mix, and it does a pretty good. It's a pretty good trick. Works out pretty well. Anyway, so here you do have some aggressive brass between these mezzo forte, fortissimos. I was going for that anyway. You can see I'm using fortissimo on the trumpet, so it's within what I like. But some people might hear this and say, well, I wouldn't want to do that. Well, what you would do is you would have another layer of mezzo forte that you would switch off to with a higher mix in those places where you really, really need to do that. And generally, you don't need to do that very much. Another thing about the mix, too, is to be realistic, the brass section should be able to cover the ensemble. So I set my brass high in the mix, and then everything sits below that, particularly trumpet and trombone. These go up quite high. I have them up near the roof, and then everything else is below that, because between the trumpets and trombones, you really should be able to bury the entire symphony, at least in a recording kind of environment where you'd be mixing. And you can hear this in film score, particularly classic film score or symphonic film score. Over the last, 50 years. The brass are really strong. So I mix them up. That way, whenever you are playing at mezzo forte, on these trumpets, it can be heard. It does stick out over the top. And then you have that available to you. So just mix them up a little higher, and then, hover around mezzo forte more and use accents rather than going to forte. That's one way to resolve some of those issues. So anyway, a little bit more about the mix and some of the Muse sound things that you have to worry about. So we'll pick up where we left off. Okay, so we have another statement of the pitch collection, the Topsail theme down here, and you can see both times I modulate. Both times I take the modulation, that major third modulation on the final note. One quick thing about modulation. I believe strongly in modulation. I am very disheartened by the state of film score today, particularly in live action music, movies, live action movies, that the music does not move. It does not change. It just stays stagnant in one location. You have to get to the animations to really find a lot of epic writing and modulation. And I don't mean everything needs to be epic writing, but it's just harmony is an element that is underused. Harmonic change, harmonic alteration, harmonic journey. There's not a lot of that in a lot of film music today. So I believe strongly in modulation and modulating frequently. However, I will say this, one trick that you can play, especially if you're writing for younger ensembles, just something to think about, is modulation doesn't mean you have to go a lot of different places. You can modulate between just a couple places, back and forth, or go or cycle around maybe 3 different tonal centers and stay in a very, very accessible location. And it still creates that feeling, that sense of a harmonic journey. So you don't necessarily remember what key you came from 2 keys ago. You can always cycle back around, which is something I do in here. I end up in E a lot whenever I am bringing up this little motive. You'll find that we end up in the same kinds of locations with frequency as the themes keep coming back. But because we're taking a journey between the 2 instances of them, it feels like it's in an entirely new environment. So that's just a good sonic concept in terms of modulation. You don't have to go a lot of different places. You can go a few places, but you should be changing your location with some frequency if you want to use that, if you want to use what music can do with respect to harmonic journey, you should be moving frequently. So I try to do that with some frequency in this piece. We come back to this melody again. Okay, so another statement of the theme there, and then we're going to modulate. We're going to move into another place. And I do the modulation trick here onto the major third, but then I also give a cadence point so that I can get to another location. And I'm going to have new material here, and we'll talk about that new material in a moment. Just a few things about this with respect to percussion, because we haven't talked about much about percussion. I write my symphonic music. I kind of operate on the philosophy that I should write the entire piece without percussion. And then I go back and I add percussion where it works and where it does something more for the music. So the percussion is quite sparse in this. Now, I've written percussion pieces, so this is not like a philosophy I have for percussion writing. It's just in symphonic writing, if I'm using a symphony orchestra where the focus is not percussion, percussion is a very auxiliary kind of section. So you'll see I'll have just a percussion instrument pop in every now and then. I'm using some stick hits up here on the snare drum, tom drums down here, a little bit of timpani action going on. I also I don't get caught up, particularly for timpani parts, in what a timpanist needs to deal with. I tend to just write what I want, the notes that I want. Now, I don't get crazy with it, but when I was in my 20s, I marched in a drum and bugle corps. My teens and 20s, I marched in a drum and bugle corps. And it was one of the really big, well-known ones, the Bluecoats from Canton, Ohio. It was a drum corps, international drum corps. And if you know anything about that, you'll know what I'm talking about. But when I was in the drum corps, I noticed in the percussion complement, there was a timpanist. And this is how all the drum corps had. They had 1 million drums. I mean, they just had twice as many drums as what you normally would need. 6 to 8 drums rather than the typical 3 to 4. And they played them very much like a melodic instrument. So once I saw that, I kind of gave up on any concerns about what a timpanist can and cannot do when I'm writing professional level music. I just try not to get carried away so that there's a lot of different changes going on. So you see there's a little bit of variety going on here, and using quite a few drums, a little bit of retuning that might be happening in my timpani parts. But I just don't care. I don't get too caught up in the restrictions of timpani playing. I just don't use a lot of timpani. I use it only when I need it, and I don't place a lot of hard restrictions on what I can have them play. I just have them play what I want. So that's kind of the percussion complement there. Some cymbals and other things will be coming up later on that we've already heard, but just a quick reference on that. So now, new material. We're coming into the section here, and you see that the meter is 5/2. 5/2. Now, I'm using 5 here not because of what it has with respect to what makes rhythm interesting. I'm using it because I'm using it for the feature that you can't tell what it is. You can't tell what the meter is. It's ambiguous. It's very difficult to differentiate exactly what the beat structure is going on in here. This is very morphing and moving and shifting. I mean, there's not like direct imagery going on here, but I guess with respect to the topic, it's very shifting, sand blowing, sand moving, shifting water current kind of music. I don't know. It's very impressionistic, and expressionistic kind of writing here. There's not a clear melody. What I'm using is chord associations. It's not really modulation, but I'm kind of reestablishing the tonal center almost every measure or two. And I'm just writing in a very expressionist kind of way to convey that sort of sensation of shifting and motion. And 5/2 works really well. You can address timing in a mock-up a number of different ways. You can have tempo changes wherever you need something to hold, or you can just meter it out. Because this is a mock-up, I just meter it out. So if I have a big hold here, I just double up the measures, or I add a metrical change to add a couple of extra beats where I want them. And you wouldn't necessarily feel these metrical changes in terms of listening to the piece. It would feel like things are slowing down or sustaining, but there's no tempo changes in here. So rather than add a tempo change or fermatas, I'm just metering everything out. So essentially we're going here at half time once we get to the 5/2 from the tempo that we've been sitting at, which is in the 140s. So we're in half time, but it doesn't necessarily come out that way. It doesn't feel that way. It just feels like ambiguity of metrical music. The music is freely shifting. There's clearly a beat structure because you can sense divisions of the beat, but you can't really tell how many beats are in a particular measure and in a particular moment. So that's what we have going on here. Big climactic moment. We're going to come back to that cipher here in a moment. Just a few things about this. So I have some division going on in the violin section. And what I did is I took the solo instrument and I put it an octave above the sections. I find this works really, really well. I've heard a lot of recordings, particularly film recordings, where when they divide, you really start to hear the individual players, particularly the highest ones. And there's probably only 3 maximum that take that high divide. So I found that this is a really, really good illusion for divisi. Take the solo instrument, put it on the higher part, the higher frequency that travels faster and further and can be heard a lot more easily anyway. And then leave the sections in the lower one. And this way you have division. You have a more intimate texture because you hear that solo sound popping in and out. And you don't exponentially increase your section by dividing out section samples. So anyway, just a quick idea on that in terms of mock-up. And a lot of the things I'm talking about here could be applied to DAW, to Digital Audio Workstation MIDI sequencing too. You know, this is not specific to Musescore. Tuplets down here on runs. I find that it helps to make the runs kind of smush together a little bit better, so I do that with frequency, particularly on Musescore. You don't want to have very, very clear, clean, metered out notation on some of these runs, especially when they're supposed to be more of a flourish. So that's one way that I address that. I just add some tuplets in. Another thing up here, if you look at the brass scoring, you'll notice that there's some weird rests, just random rests placed in there. So Musescore 4, Muse Sounds, defaults to legato. And it kind of makes sense. People griped and complained about that, and they continue to, that the strings in particular sound very legato. Well, it makes sense because neutral playing is legato. It's tongued and it's rebowed, it's articulated, but the notes connect one note to the next to the next. In order to have separation, you would need to add an articulation on it. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's not a difference between normal neutral playing without a legato slur versus having a legato slur. There is a difference, but I think there's a rationale to why Musescore 4 plays legato by default. I think there still is at the sample level articulation going on in most cases, although some of the portamento will stick out a little bit more on the brass instruments and on the strings when you're changing notes, and it can feel very legato, like it's connected. But those artifacts would exist no matter what. So what I need to do here for the brass in particular, and in the strings later on, if we point it out, if I remember to, I need to create separation when I need to have it. These brass players need to breathe. So, and when they take a breath, they take big breaths. Woodwind players too. So I place rests where I need the breathing to happen. This is more realistic. When a player takes a breath, it is almost as if they're placing a rest in there, a larger gap, a larger quality of space in order to get the air that they need to continue on. So I've placed a lot of breaths in here on the brass parts, and you'll see this very much later on in the big brassy moments, so that I can emulate realistic playing. If I didn't have those in there, it would feel very computer-like, even though the samples are very good. And again, whenever I need to have string separation, notice I'm not using a lot of legato slurs, but it's coming out very legato. I don't need to add them because the samples are already playing at a legato neutral kind of state. So I don't need to add more work that I don't need to do. I only need to add the legatos if I really want to overemphasize it and call upon some samples that are not satisfactory to the legato style that I want. Going on, we're going to get the melody again. So let's find that. Oh, another thing too, they have improved the forte piano articulation in the brass in particular over the last few installments of Muse Sounds, but it's still not perfect. So every now and then I find that some samples don't call out right, these high trumpet samples. It will play. They also seem to have extended the range, thank goodness. So we're getting that high D on the trumpets, written D, concert C. I think they should add sounds for the brass instruments that go into the stratosphere, because that is realistic in commercial playing. They would be able to play way up there, but it does seem to cap out. Now you can use the classic Muse sounds, or rather the Musescore classic sounds, to kind of fill out holes that are in there. You just kind of mix it down, add a little bit of extra reverb, and it works out okay. I've done that before. Particularly whenever I run out of trumpet notes in the sample collection. But way up here, this forte piano, it was not working on this one. So I actually wrote in a decrescendo rearticulation at a very low pianissimo, and then I bring it up to the fortissimo, just on that one note to make it work out. Works out pretty well. Let's pick up here where we left off. So here it is, right? I needed detached playing. So I put a detached articulation on every note. I have pizzicato running down here in the low strings, and then the upper strings are playing this accented staccato accent throughout. And that's what you got to do to call up on the samples that you need. Don't be afraid to oversaturate the score in Musescore 4 for mock-up purposes with both dynamics and articulations in order to get what you need. And also add rests for the breathing so that when players can breathe in a natural way, this sounds very realistic. You'll see later on as we get to the really big brass moment, the gaps that I put in there for the brass players that really would be necessary in order to play and would be heard in that way in a real environment. So going on. Okay, let me talk about that real quick. So we went to kind of a minor quality here. It's different kind of sensation of uncertainty. And then this is essentially aleatory up here. This would be an aleatoric box. It would have the pitch collection. If I was writing this and putting it out there on paper for musicians to play, there'd be an arrow, a line in a space with the pitch collection spelled out with note heads, which is the cipher. And then it would have some instructions on there. It would say, play twice at random speeds and random registers. And that's what you would get. So I just notated it out here. It's the cipher notes in sequence, played twice, a couple times per instrument between the celeste, the piano, and the upper register. And then some other tingly sorts of things going on here. I've got a mark tree playing through that, and then the triangle adding a little bit of extra little stuff going on up there. This would be aleatoric box. That's how you would notate this for real if I was actually scoring this out. But it's a mock-up, so I don't need to do that. I just kind of put out everything that's on there. And this is an interlude moment. We're going to come into a very heavy brass section. So let's listen to this again in context. Okay, let's talk about that real quick. So, yeah, this is the big unapologetic, close encounters moment. It's not the same, it's not the same collection, it's not the same pitch collection, it's not the same chord progression. It has some similar texture to that in terms of what's happening in the repetition of it all. And it's got this big sweeping moment in the middle, which is very, Max Steiner-like, I guess. Just very free-floating harmonic motion. This is taken from that section, see the 5-2. This idea, this material is taken from that section earlier, so it's not entirely new material, but it's used in a different way in connection with this pitch collection fanfare that we're getting in the brass section. So just look at this. look at the large gaps I'm placing in here for each instrument where they would be breathing. So I kind of I didn't play through it, but I imagined playing through each of these parts as a brass player, thinking, well, I would take a breath here, I would need a heap of air here, I would need to articulate here in this way. And notice too, I've mixed up on these triplets, I've mixed up some marcato and some staccato accented articulation to generate what double or multiple tonguing really would sound like. Now, Musescore 4, Muse Sounds, does a pretty good job at avoiding machine gunning. That is the repetition of the same sample. However, without adding these little articulations, there still is a little bit of machine gunning that happens in there. So by adding articulations and differentiating between the notes, it'll call on different samples, and it will actually have this play out like a real player would play it. So as a brass player, I've actually thought about how this would sound note for note, and I've come up with this combination in the places where I have these repeated notes and triplets going on there. A maximum of 3 horns is what we end up with in terms of division. At this dynamic and with all the other things going on, it sounds like section playing even when there's only one note. So you can kind of see how this illusion really does work better working with solo instruments versus working with section instruments and then having to split out to solo patches later on when you divide. If you really want to make trumpets sound massive, play them in octaves rather than filling out harmony in the middle. You can make a dense sound by filling out harmony in the middle, but this is just something I like to do. When I really am emphasizing the melody in the trumpets, I'll have them play in octaves, something I picked up from my drum corps days. That's how a lot of the orchestration was done for that section. The soprano bugles would often have a high lead playing the principal melodic material, and then another instance of that exact same voice an octave lower to really make it sound huge. So that's something I like to do in my brass writing whenever it needs to be massive. So anyway, that's a little bit of explanation for what's going on there. In terms of runs and these little trilly moments, these very Williams-esque kinds of things here going on, I just have a wide interval being played between the woodwinds, duplicated by the upper strings down, or the keyboards down here, the piano and the celeste. And then the strings are playing some tremolo figures, accented start, tremolo, some 16th note runs in the violins separated by octaves. And then this comes out to this division. Again, this very Max Steiner-like, sweeping, freely flowing melodic kind of material over here in this interlude section between fanfares. And we have a big cadential moment, big cadence, and then it comes back into the fanfare material again. It's essentially a restatement, but we end up in a different place. And the voices change. So what I did is I swapped responsibilities from the first instance of the fanfare to the second one. So different instrument voices are playing different parts. And then at the very end, the trumpets take over the melody again when it slows down, and we have the last big hit. And this big sweeping rush into a modulation. And then we have this descending figure that we had at the very beginning of the piece that's shown up a few times, and a decrescendo. And we come out of this into a couple more restatements of the melodic material that we had in the cipher, and we conclude the piece. So let's pick up here. And that's the piece. So what's happening here? We have one more statement of the kind of energetic motive theme being played in the Celestin piano and some of the woodwinds, a little bit of a horn accompaniment going on there, some low brass stuff. And then we get the statement of the cipher 3 times. And this time, rather than modulate, which is what it's been doing all along, it just settles on that universe of C. But what I do is I insert in between them a couple of unsettled half cadence moments. So I'm doing a little bit of modal borrowing on there to add some chromaticism to it. And it just gives a really good forward-moving sensation so that I can state it again. And then I give a really nice minor 4 to one kind of resolution here on the very end to do that little heartstring kind of trick that shows up so much in film music today. So that's the piece. Hope you enjoyed this little dive into it and some of the discussion that we've had. I hope I've taught you some things. If you've been looking for some ways to use Musescore 4 for mock-up, hopefully I've given you some things to ponder and to think about. And this is not, I don't work this way every time. There's a lot of different techniques, particularly with tempo and meter, that I will grab from in different situations. But for this piece, it really made a lot of sense to deal with the meter and duplicate measures and just kind of meter everything out in terms of the length of notes and the changes of the sensation of the changing sensation of the tempo, even though the tempo really is never changing throughout the piece. Hopefully I've taught you a few things too about some orchestration, some things to think about, and ways to approach family writing and mock-up issues that you might be running into, maybe not just in Musescore 4 or a notation program, but also in your digital audio workstation if that's where you like to do your mock-up. Anyway, best of luck with all of this, and happy composing and happy mixing.